Hi students, welcome to HSC Biology and Module 7, Infectious Disease. This is video number 24. We're going to introduce a few more terms associated with the study of disease and talk a little bit about controlling a pandemic. So what you need to be able to do in this particular outcome is to investigate and evaluate environmental management and quarantine methods used to control an epidemic or a pandemic. So we're going to make sure that we understand the difference in the scale of each of these terms. We're also going to introduce two other terms that are really important when we're studying infectious disease. Those terms, which we've probably used along the way anyway, are incidence and prevalence, but they do mean two different things. And to be able to evaluate how effective different types of environmental management methods are in addressing and hopefully controlling serious disease outbreaks. So first of all, a couple of key terms, and they really are terms of scale more than anything else. The first one is about endemic disease. So endemic, if something's endemic, then it's found in a local area. So it tends to be confined to a relatively small area. So something that was happening in your community around the school, that would be an endemic kind of a disease, something that hasn't really taken off anywhere, just a few people in a small area. Now, of course, this can still be a problem if the disease is a very serious one, but at least we know that at this stage, it's confined to a fairly small group. When we shoot from endemic to epidemic, then we're starting to spread the net a little further. So these are more widespread, but generally speaking, epidemics tend to be still close to the original source. So for example, they could be, it's the city of Sydney, for example, might be an epidemic there. We wouldn't necessarily talk about something that was endemic. We would more talk about maybe the outbreak that occurred in the northern beaches. That might be endemic if we can keep people isolated in that area, just a small place. But if it spreads then to the greater Sydney area, then we start to talk about epidemics. We're starting to talk about something that's a little bit bigger, a larger scale, could be regional, could be statewide. We could talk about the incidence of certain diseases in New South Wales. We may even talk about our country, Australia, as part of our discussions of epidemic. So hopefully you understand that these terms are a little fluid in terms of the boundaries that we set for them. When we get to the next one, of course, well, that's the one that we've all talked about in terms of COVID, because it's worldwide, it's everywhere. And it's not just one country that's had really bad numbers and all the rest of them are okay. It's very large numbers, very large number of cases over a very large number of countries. And so that gets the tick as a pandemic, a worldwide distribution of hosts, or at least people who are suffering from the disease. So we want to be able to have a little bit of a look at the science associated with that. And the science that's associated with the study of disease is called epidemiology. And specifically, it's about the incidence and prevalence. And they're two terms which we'll talk about in a second as well. But it's very much about the statistics of disease. And it's looking at statistics from a number of different viewpoints. It's applied to non-infectious diseases at least as often, or probably more often, than it is to infectious disease. But still, there's a lot of very important epidemiological studies that have given us some really important information about infectious disease. So the first of these terms that we've been looking at is, or I've been using and want to make sure that we're clear with, is incidence. Now, incidence is basically if you link incidence to new. So when we're looking at the new cases of a disease over a particular period of time, so if you're looking at COVID numbers, often the COVID numbers update every 24 hours. So if you're looking over a 24-hour period, that would be your time period, your specified time period. Then we can look at the number of new cases. So the ones that we didn't know about in the previous 24 hours, now we know about these cases. That would be your incidence. If you look at the population as a whole and work out what proportion of that population are new cases, then you'll get a percentage, which is often the way that a lot of these values are expressed. If the numbers are very small, in Australia, a population of 25, 26 million, one or two cases gives you a percentage that's really a nonsense. It's just too small to be meaningful. So then we would talk about the absolute value. We might say there's been 3 new cases of COVID overnight. But if it's becomes larger, then sometimes those numbers become a little bit nonsensical, and so then we can start to talk about a 5%, a 1%, 2% change in incidence. Prevalence is basically calculated the same way, but it's now talking about total numbers. So when you were looking at incidence, you were looking at new cases. When we're looking at prevalence, we're looking at total cases. So this is giving us the whole picture. So incidence is just about, is it still here? Are we still getting new cases? Prevalence is what's happened historically. So over time, what is the total number of cases that we have? Now, we could have had a lot of people, for example, exposed to a virus like COVID, and all of them have either recovered or none of them are currently infectious. And so therefore we might have a zero incidence despite the fact that we have a reasonable prevalence. We might have, a 1% of the population prevalence. Now these, of course, are going to be much bigger for certain types of diseases and in certain areas of the world. One of the things that's very important, though, is that when we're talking about outbreaks, both of these are important factors to consider, incidence and prevalence. But more than that, different types of diseases are going to send out different warnings based on differences in the numbers of incidence and prevalence. So let's have a quick look at those. So outbreaks are really associated with the incidence of a rare disease, so something that we didn't know about when COVID popped up. We were a little bit worried about that because we had no information about that. If we had cases of something like Ebola popping up or tuberculosis, we would be a little panicked. We'd be a little bit worried. Okay, these are 1 or 2 cases is still a problem. So if the incidence of something that's rare or very dangerous, potentially deadly, very high virulence that we think is, we're worried about spreading quickly through a population, these are things that would trigger a bit of an alert. By the same token, 1 or 2 cases of the flu virus, for example, probably no one's going to care about because the flu seems to be something that visits us every winter. However, if in your local area you suddenly found numbers of around 20,000, you might be starting to go, hang on a minute, that's a little bit high for this area. This seems higher than usual for the number of people who are getting this particular disease. Maybe there's a concentration, maybe there's a change in the strain, maybe there's a variation in the resistance. So sometimes big numbers, higher than you expect. So yes, we expect there's going to be a bit of this in the population, but we didn't think the numbers would be quite as high as this. And obviously the numbers are going to very much depend on the size of the population, the size of the area, the type of disease that we're talking about before we start worrying. However, in either of these cases, if we have a case where we have an incidence of something concerning that pops up, or we have a higher incidence than usual, a higher prevalence than we would normally expect, then we might start to look at some of these different strategies. 2 of the ones that are going to likely kick in fairly quickly are quarantine and environmental management. The quarantine is something we've talked about previously, and it's probably the one that we're most familiar with, particularly in terms of things like COVID. So this is going to be basically about isolation, keeping the affected individuals isolated from the population as much as possible. One way to do that, of course, is with lockdowns. And we've all experienced the situation where we've actually been not confined to our homes, but really within, except for very needful reasons, to be trying to sort of maintain ourselves in our own homes in order to try and again isolate ourselves from potentially infected individuals. Another thing we can do is we can look at environmental management strategies, and that'll be the last thing we look at in this video. So here's some of the key environmental management strategies. So obviously one of the first and most important things is adequate healthcare, is being able to get health workers to the sick or the affected in some way that we can make sure that they are getting the best care that they possibly can. We need to think about control measures, and of course that can involve things like isolation, but it might also mean a step up in things like hygienic practices. And you might remember we were all very, very concerned about washing our hands, using sanitizers, wiping down surfaces, trying to make sure that our hygiene practices, while they're probably already good, were even better. And I guess more at the front of our minds. We're more conscious of what we were doing in terms of controlling ways of trying to minimize the transmission of the pathogen from one host to another. Sometimes it's about keeping an eye on water quality. So there can be pathogens that can be present in the water. And of course, most areas around the world have some form of water treatment to try and improve the quality of things like drinking water, but not all areas. And certainly when devastations occur, the little picture in the background is Haiti after the Cyclone Matthew went through there, or Hurricane Matthew went through there, and caused a huge amount of devastation. Of course, one of the things that can be affected is water quality very, very quickly. So bringing water into an affected area can often be one of the key activities that occurs for those frontline support services. Food's also important, particularly again if electricity is lost, then keeping things cool. Refrigerated or frozen can be a problem, and it means that you've got a higher chance of food spoilage. And of course, there are certain types of diseases that are more likely to be passed through foods. So again, the whole area of food preparation, storage, service, disposal all become very important. And of course, disposal also matters for human waste, for the waste from medical processes. So all of those sorts of things are part of good sanitation, making sure that all of those are in place as well. Sometimes we need to look at air quality, and air quality can be important not just from pollutants, which might exacerbate conditions, but also if there are airborne pathogens, we may need to seal areas off in order to try and, again, minimize that transmission of pathogens from one host to another. And the final area is human mobility. And again, human mobility often links back to these areas of isolation or quarantine. How many people are moving around? The fact that we are such a mobile society now, we travel a lot, not just for work, for pleasure, for vacations. It means that a lot of people are moving around, and obviously that if they're carrying pathogens, that gives a great opportunity for the pathogen to be able to move into different areas, often very quickly. So we need to keep an eye on human mobility, and sometimes we might even need to legislate some changes that occur as a result of the greater risk associated with movement. So just a little bit of an overview about some of those key terms associated with the study of infectious disease, and also some of the ways that we go about trying to manage outbreaks so that they don't scale up to epidemics or pandemics. Thanks for watching.